The Arizona Territory baked under a relentless August sun that turned the desert floor into a shimmering furnace of red sand and scattered sage. Jake Thornfield squinted against the glare as he guided his paint horse along the dusty trail that wound between towering saguaro cacti and jagged rock formations that looked like the broken teeth of some ancient giant. At 34, Jake had the weathered look of a man who'd spent his adult life under the open sky, his blue eyes pale from years of desert glare, and his brown hair bleached nearly blonde by the unforgiving southwestern sun. He was 3 days out from Tombstone, carrying dispatches for the territorial governor, and enough silver in his saddlebags to make the journey worthwhile, when he first heard the sound that would change his life forever. It drifted across the desert stillness like a ghost's whisper, the thin, desperate crying of a child in distress. Jake reined in his horse and listened carefully, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip. The desert was full of tricks that could lead an unwary traveler to his death, and phantom sounds were among the most dangerous. But this cry came again, clearly human and unmistakably real, carried on the hot wind from somewhere among the maze of red rock canyons to his left. Following the sound, Jake guided his horse off the main trail and into a narrow canyon that cut deep into the surrounding mesa. The walls rose 100 feet on either side, their surfaces carved by millennia of flash floods into fantastic shapes and colors that ranged from deep crimson to pale yellow. In the blessed shade of the canyon, the temperature dropped 20 degrees, and Jake's horse nickered gratefully as they picked their way along a rocky stream bed that was bone dry except for a few scattered pools of brackish water. The crying grew louder as they penetrated deeper into the canyon, and soon Jake could hear adult voices as well, a woman's voice, speaking in rapid Spanish, and a man's deeper tones responding with what sounded like pain and exhaustion. Around a bend in the canyon wall, Jake discovered the source of the sounds that had drawn him from the safety of the main trail. A small family group had taken shelter beneath an overhang of red rock, their few possessions scattered around what looked like a makeshift camp that had seen better days. The woman was perhaps 25, with the kind of delicate beauty that spoke of Spanish ancestry mixed with something else, perhaps Apache or Pima blood. She was trying to comfort 2 small children while tending to a man who lay on a blanket, his leg clearly broken and his face gray with pain and fever. The man was older, maybe 40, with the calloused hands of someone who worked with tools and the sun-darkened skin of a lifetime spent outdoors. When he saw Jake approaching, he struggled to sit up, his hand moving toward an old rifle that lay beside him on the blanket. "Easy there, friend," Jake called out, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. Heard crying and thought someone might need help. The woman looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of hope and desperate caution. When she spoke, her English was accented but clear. "Please, senor. My husband is very hurt. We have been here 3 days, and he grows worse." Jake dismounted and approached carefully, noting the way the family's meager supplies were arranged and the obvious signs of people who were traveling light and traveling scared. The children, a boy of perhaps 8 and a girl who couldn't be more than 5, watched him with the wide-eyed wariness of youngsters who'd learned that strangers could mean danger. The injured man's name was Diego Montoya, and his story emerged slowly as Jake examined his injuries and listened to his wife Maria's worried explanations. They were fleeing Mexico, where Diego's small silver mine had attracted the attention of a corrupt official who demanded impossible bribes and threatened violence when Diego couldn't pay. "We left everything," Maria explained as Jake carefully probed Diego's swollen leg, checking for signs of infection around the badly set break. "Our home, our friends, most of our possessions. Diego said we could start over in America, but then this happened." The injury had occurred 2 days earlier when Diego's horse had stepped in a prairie dog hole, throwing him hard and snapping his leg like a dry branch. The family had managed to splint it with pieces of wood from their broken wagon, but they'd done so incorrectly, and now the bone was healing crooked while infection threatened to set in. "This needs to be reset," Jake said grimly, understanding what that would mean for Diego. "It's going to hurt like hell, but if we don't do it right, you might never walk normally again." Diego nodded, his jaw clenched with determination. "Do what you must, senor. I have children to provide for, and a man who cannot work is no good to his family." Jake spent the rest of the daylight hours tending to Diego's injury, using techniques he'd learned during his years as a cavalry scout when proper medical care was often unavailable. He reset the bone, a process that left Diego unconscious from pain despite his attempts to stay stoic, and fashioned a proper splint from materials in his own pack. While Diego recovered from the ordeal, Jake turned his attention to the family's other needs. Their food was nearly exhausted, consisting mainly of dried corn and a few strips of jerky that wouldn't last another day. Their water was running low, and their knowledge of the surrounding country was limited to what they'd learned from a hand-drawn map that was more optimistic than accurate. "Where were you heading?" Jake asked as he shared his own trail rations with the hungry children. "Tucson," Maria replied. "We heard there were opportunities there for men who know mining and metalwork. Diego is very skilled. He can find silver where others see only rock, and he can work it into beautiful things." Jake nodded, understanding the plan even if he doubted its practicality. Tucson was growing rapidly as mining activity expanded throughout the territory, but it was also attracting every desperado and confidence man in the Southwest. A Mexican family with no connections and few resources would find it a hard place to establish themselves, especially with Diego handicapped by his injury. "It's still 4 days hard travel to Tucson," Jake said gently, "and that's for healthy folks, with good horses. In your condition, with those children to think about, it could take a week or more." The implications of his words were clear to everyone. They didn't have enough supplies for a week-long journey. Diego couldn't travel safely until his leg healed considerably more, and every day they remained in the desert increased the risk of being discovered by bandits, hostile Indians, or Mexican authorities who might be pursuing them. That night, as the family slept around a carefully banked fire, Jake sat watching the stars and wrestling with a decision that would test everything he believed about duty, compassion, and the responsibilities that came with being able to help those who couldn't help themselves. Dawn brought clarity to Jake's internal struggle. He couldn't in good conscience leave this family to face the desert alone, not when he had the knowledge and resources to help them survive. His dispatches for the territorial governor would have to wait. There were more important things than government business when lives hung in the balance. "Here's what we're going to do," Jake announced as the family gathered around the morning fire. "I'm taking you to Tucson, but we're not going to rush and risk making Diego's leg worse. We'll travel slow and careful, rest when we need to, and make sure everyone arrives healthy." Maria's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Senor Jake, we have no money to pay you for such kindness. We lost everything when we fled Mexico." "Did I ask for payment?" Jake replied with a gentle smile. "Sometimes a man helps others because it's the right thing to do, not because he expects to profit from it." The children, Miguel and little Sofia, had warmed to Jake quickly once they realized he meant no harm. Miguel was fascinated by Jake's guns and his stories of life as a scout, while Sofia had taken to calling him Tio Jake, Uncle Jake, despite having known him for less than a day. Preparing the family for travel required ingenuity and patience. Jake fashioned a travois from deadwood and rope, creating a carrier that would allow Diego to travel without putting weight on his injured leg. He redistributed their supplies to make better use of the pack animals, and he spent time teaching Miguel and Maria basic desert survival skills that might save their lives if they were ever separated. "Water is life in this country," Jake explained as they practiced finding and purifying water from questionable sources. "You can go days without food if you have to, but a day without water in the desert heat can kill you. Always know where your next drink is coming from." The journey to Tucson took 6 days, traveling at a pace dictated by Diego's condition and the endurance of the children. They moved during the cooler hours of early morning and late afternoon, resting during the brutal midday heat in whatever shade they could find among the rocks and cacti. Jake found himself enjoying the companionship more than he'd expected. For 5 years since leaving the cavalry, he'd lived the solitary life of a messenger and occasional guide, sleeping alone under the stars and speaking to no one for days at a time. The sound of children's laughter and the comfortable domestic routine of family life awakened something in him that he'd thought was permanently buried. Maria proved to be an excellent trail cook, able to create nourishing meals from the simplest ingredients and stretch their supplies far beyond what Jake would have thought possible. Diego, despite his injury, contributed by teaching Jake traditional techniques for reading the desert landscape and finding resources that weren't obvious to untrained eyes. "My grandfather was Tohono O'odham," Diego explained as he showed Jake how to identify edible cactus fruits and locate water by observing the behavior of desert animals. "He taught me that the desert provides for those who know how to see its gifts." On their 4th night together, as they camped beside a tiny spring hidden among granite boulders, Diego broached a subject that had clearly been weighing on his mind. "Senor Jake, when we reach Tucson, what will you do? Will you stay, or will you continue with your own business?" Jake had been wondering the same thing. His life of constant travel and temporary attachments had suited him after the war, when he'd been too restless and emotionally damaged to settle anywhere. But these past days with the Montoya family had shown him what he'd been missing: the warmth of human connection, the satisfaction of being needed, and the simple pleasure of belonging somewhere. "I reckon that depends on whether Tucson has anything to offer a man like me," Jake said diplomatically. "I've got some government business to finish, but after that, my time's my own." Tucson, in 1882, was a town caught between its sleepy past as a Mexican presidio and its booming future as an American mining and railroad center. Adobe buildings baked in the sun alongside newer frame structures that proclaimed their owners' American origins and aspirations. The streets were crowded with miners, merchants, Mexican vaqueros, Apache scouts, Chinese laborers, and every variety of fortune seeker that the expanding frontier attracted. Jake helped establish the Montoya family in a modest adobe house near the Mexican quarter of town, using his connections and reputation to find Diego work with a local assayer despite the man's injured leg. Maria took in sewing and laundry to supplement their income, while the children began attending the mission school where they could learn English alongside the Spanish and desert wisdom they'd inherited from their parents. "It's not much," Diego said as they surveyed the small house with its packed dirt floor and single room. "But it's ours, and we're safe here. That's more than we had a week ago." Jake found himself reluctant to leave the family he'd grown attached to during their journey. He completed his government business quickly, delivering his dispatches and collecting his payment, but instead of immediately accepting another assignment, he decided to remain in Tucson for a few more weeks. The decision proved fortuitous when Diego's knowledge of silver mining and metalworking attracted the attention of several local businessmen. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community that there was a Mexican craftsman who could not only identify promising ore deposits but could also work raw silver into jewelry and decorative items that commanded premium prices. From wealthy buyers, "My grandfather taught me the old ways," Diego explained to Jake as he demonstrated his techniques in a makeshift workshop behind their house. How to read the signs that lead to silver veins, how to extract the metal without wasting it, how to work it while it's still pure and soft. These are skills that have been in my family for generations. Within a month, Diego had attracted enough work to support his family comfortably, despite his mobility limitations. Local mine owners consulted him about new prospects. Wealthy ranchers commissioned custom silver work, and even the territorial government sought his expertise in evaluating mining claims that were in dispute. Jake, meanwhile, had found his own opportunities in the growing town. His reputation as an honest guide and reliable courier had earned him a steady stream of well-paying jobs, and his growing friendship with the Montoya family had introduced him to the Mexican-American community that controlled much of the legitimate business in Tucson. But it was little Sophia who provided the most compelling reason for Jake to consider making Tucson his permanent home. The 5-year-old had adopted him as a substitute uncle and grandfather rolled into one, following him around town and chattering constantly in a mixture of Spanish and English that charmed everyone who heard it. "Tio Jake," she announced one afternoon as he was preparing for what he'd told himself would be his final job before moving on. "Papa says you're going away again. Why don't you stay here with us?" The question, asked with the innocent directness that only children possess, cut straight to the heart of Jake's uncertainty about his future. He'd spent 5 years telling himself that he preferred the freedom of constant movement, but Sophia's simple question forced him to acknowledge that freedom could also mean loneliness. "Sometimes a man has to work in different places," Jake explained, kneeling down to Sophia's eye level. "But that doesn't mean he stops caring about the people who matter to him." Sophia considered this explanation with the seriousness that children bring to important matters. "If you have to go to work, can you come back here when you're done? This could be your home too." The job that took Jake away from Tucson was supposed to be routine, guiding a group of Eastern investors to inspect mining claims in the remote canyons north of town. The investors, led by a pompous banker named Harrington, were considering financing a large-scale silver mining operation and needed an experienced guide to evaluate the terrain and logistics. Jake accepted the job partly for the substantial fee it offered, but mostly because he needed time away from Tucson to think clearly about his future. The attachment he'd formed to the Montoya family was stronger than anything he'd experienced since leaving the cavalry, and it scared him more than he cared to admit. The mining claims they were inspecting lay in a region of red rock canyons and mesas that reminded Jake of the country where he'd first met the Montoyas. The similarity wasn't lost on him as they made camp on their second night out. and he found himself thinking about the strange chain of events that had brought that desperate family into his life. "This is rugged country," observed Dr. Morrison, a geologist from Chicago who was part of Harrington's expedition. "Beautiful in its way, but it would be expensive and difficult to extract ore from such remote locations." Jake nodded, understanding both the attractions and the challenges that the landscape presented. "It's the kind of country that keeps its secrets well hidden. A man could spend years learning its ways and still be surprised by what he finds." What they found on their third day out was indeed surprising, though not in the way any of them had expected. Following a narrow canyon that showed promising geological formations, they discovered evidence of recent mining activity, not the systematic work of an established operation, but the careful, almost secretive excavations of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. "Someone's been working this area," Jake observed, examining the carefully concealed mine shafts and the traces of ore that had been extracted and processed on site. "Professional work, but small scale. They didn't want to attract attention." Dr. Morrison's examination of the site revealed why secrecy had been necessary. "This isn't just silver," he announced, his voice tight with excitement. "There's gold here too. High-grade ore that would be worth a fortune in the San Francisco markets." The discovery created immediate tension within the group. Harrington saw dollar signs and began making plans for large-scale development, while Dr. Morrison worried about claim jumping and the violent conflicts that major gold discoveries inevitably attracted. Jake, with his knowledge of frontier law and mining politics, understood that they'd stumbled onto something that could either make them rich or get them killed. "We need to be careful about who we tell about this," Jake warned as they made camp near the hidden workings. "Word gets out about gold in this country, and we'll have every desperado and claim jumper in the territory fighting over it." That night, as the Eastern investors debated their options around the campfire, Jake noticed movement in the rocks above their camp. His years as a cavalry scout had taught him to read the subtle signs that indicated human presence in wild country, and every instinct he possessed was telling him they were being watched. The attack came just before dawn, launched by a dozen Mexican banditos who'd been tracking the expedition since they'd left Tucson. The bandits had seen the signs of gold discovery and decided that killing a few Americans was a small price to pay for claiming the valuable find for themselves. Jake's warning shout saved most of the expedition members, giving them precious seconds to grab weapons and seek cover before the shooting started. But the investors were city men with little experience in wilderness combat, and it quickly became clear that they were outmatched by their attackers. The firefight raged for 2 hours, with Jake doing most of the effective shooting while the investors huddled behind rocks and tried not to get themselves killed. He'd managed to drop 3 of the bandits and wound 2 others, but ammunition was running low and their position was becoming untenable. It was then that reinforcements arrived from an unexpected direction. A group of riders appeared on the canyon rim above the bandit positions, their rifles speaking with disciplined accuracy that quickly turned the tide of battle. Within minutes, the surviving bandits were fleeing south toward the Mexican border, leaving their dead behind and abandoning any thoughts of claiming the gold discovery for themselves. As the gun smoke cleared, Jake was amazed to recognize the leader of their rescuers. Diego Montoya sat his horse with confident ease despite his healing leg, flanked by his brother-in-law Carlos and several other Mexican-American miners from Tucson, who'd apparently been following the expedition's trail. "Hola, amigo," Diego called out as he guided his horse down into the canyon. "We thought you might need some help up here." Jake stared at his friend in amazement. "Diego? What the hell are you doing out here? And how did you know we were in trouble?" Diego smiled as he dismounted, favoring his injured leg but moving with obvious improvement from his condition just weeks earlier. "We've been watching this area for months, Jake. This is where our family has been mining for generations, long before the American territorial government started issuing official claims." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. The hidden mine workings they'd discovered weren't the product of claim jumpers or illegal miners. They belonged to Diego's extended family, who'd been secretly working the claims while trying to avoid the attention of corrupt Mexican officials and claim-jumping Americans alike. "You mean this gold mine belongs to you?" Dr. Morrison asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Carlos, Diego's brother-in-law, nodded grimly. "Our grandfather discovered these veins in 1847, before the Americans took this territory from Mexico. We've been working them carefully ever since, taking only what we needed and keeping the locations secret to avoid trouble with authorities on both sides of the border." Harrington, the banker who'd been planning to file claims on the discovery, looked deflated as he realized that his dreams of easy wealth were evaporating. But surely, under American territorial law, you'll need to file proper claims and pay taxes on any extraction. Which is exactly what we plan to do, Diego interrupted firmly. Now that Mexico is no longer a threat to our family, and we have friends in Tucson who can help us navigate American law, we're ready to bring our mining operation out of the shadows. Jake was beginning to understand the real reason Diego had followed them into the canyons. The Montoya family hadn't just been fleeing persecution in Mexico. They'd been protecting a valuable secret that represented their family's financial security for generations to come. So when you said you knew mining and metalwork, Jake said slowly, you weren't talking about working for other people. You were talking about your own family business. Diego nodded, his expression serious. I couldn't tell you the full truth when we first met, Jake. We'd learned to trust no one with our secrets. But you saved my family's life, and that creates obligations that go deeper than business partnerships. The journey back to Tucson took on a completely different character as Jake learned the full scope of what Diego's family had been concealing. The hidden mine workings they'd visited represented only a small portion of claims that the Montoya extended family had been working for over 30 years. We have 11 different sites, Diego explained as they rode. Some silver, some gold. One that produces both in quantities that would make Eastern investors very excited. But we've always worked them carefully, taking only what we needed and leaving the rest for future generations. The family's mining operation had been managed with the kind of long-term thinking that was rare in the boom and bust cycle of frontier mining. Instead of stripping out all the valuable ore as quickly as possible, they developed sustainable extraction methods that preserved the integrity of the deposits while providing steady income over decades. My grandfather taught us that the earth gives up its treasures to those who approach with respect, Carlos added. Rush and greed destroy both the land and the people who work it. Better to take a little each year for many years than to take everything at once and leave nothing for our children. Back in Tucson, the true extent of the Montoya family's transformation became apparent to Jake. The modest adobe house where he'd helped them settle was just the beginning. They owned several properties throughout the Mexican quarter of town, operated a legitimate assay business that served other miners, and had accumulated enough capital to finance expansion of their operations. But why maintain the deception? Jake asked as they sat in Diego's real office, a well-appointed space behind the town's most successful Mexican restaurant. Why let me think you were destitute refugees when you're actually one of the wealthiest families in the territory? Maria, who'd been listening quietly to the conversation, answered with gentle firmness. Because we needed to know what kind of man you were, Jake. Wealthy people attract those who want to use them. Poor people discover who their real friends are. The wisdom of her words became clear as Jake reflected on his own behavior during their journey from the canyon to Tucson. He'd helped them not because he expected to profit, but because they were fellow human beings in desperate need of assistance. That kind of character couldn't be faked or bought. It could only be tested under circumstances where self-interest was set aside in favor of compassion. So the broken wagon, the lack of supplies, the desperate flight from Mexico, all true, Diego assured him. We did flee from corrupt officials who wanted to seize our mines. We were traveling light to avoid attention, and my injury was real enough. The only thing we didn't tell you was that we had resources waiting for us in Tucson, resources that we couldn't access until we knew we could trust the people around us. Young Sophia, now dressed in clothes that reflected her family's actual prosperity, ran into the office and threw herself into Jake's arms with the enthusiasm of a child who'd been eagerly awaiting his return. Tio Jake, Papa said you helped find our gold mine. Does that mean you're rich now too? The question brought the conversation to its crucial point. Jake had indeed helped protect the family's mining operation, though he'd done so unknowingly. More importantly, he'd proven through his actions that he could be trusted with the kind of valuable secrets that represented generational wealth. We want you to become our partner, Jake, Diego said formally. Not just a friend who helped us once, but a full partner in our family's mining business. You've proven your character. You understand this country better than anyone we know, and you have the connections in the American community that we need to expand our operations legally and safely. The partnership that Diego proposed was far more generous than anything Jake could have imagined when he'd first encountered the family in that desert canyon. As a full partner in the Montoya family mining operations, he would receive 1/3 of all profits, along with shared decision-making authority and access to the detailed geological knowledge that had been accumulated over decades of careful exploration. It's not charity, Diego explained as they toured the family's various properties and operations around Tucson. "We need someone who understands American business practices and has connections with territorial officials. More importantly, we need someone we can trust completely, because secrets like ours can only be kept by people who value honor over profit." The scope of the Montoya family's hidden wealth was staggering. Their 11 mining claims, properly developed, could produce enough gold and silver to make them one of the wealthiest families in the entire Arizona territory. But they'd always operated with the caution of people who understood that great wealth could attract great danger if not managed wisely. "Our grandfather lived through the Mexican War and saw how quickly fortunes could be lost when political winds changed," Carlos explained, as they visited a hidden warehouse where processed gold and silver ingots were stored in quantities that represented decades of careful extraction. "He taught us to always have reserves, always have escape plans, and always be prepared for circumstances to change." Jake spent a week studying the family's books, maps, and operational procedures before making his decision. What impressed him most wasn't the wealth itself, but the wisdom with which it had been managed. The Montoyas had created a business that could survive political upheavals, economic downturns, and the kind of violent claim jumping that destroyed so many frontier mining operations. "I accept," Jake announced during a family dinner that had been anxiously awaiting his decision. "But I have conditions of my own." Diego nodded, understanding that any meaningful partnership required contributions from all parties. "What do you propose?" "First, we formalize everything legally through the territorial courts. No more hidden operations. We file proper claims, pay proper taxes, and operate in full compliance with American law. Second, we establish a legitimate front business that can explain our prosperity without revealing the full extent of our resources. Third, we create a formal training program to teach mining and metalworking skills to other Mexican-American families in Tucson." The third condition surprised everyone, but Jake's reasoning was sound. Wealth that's hoarded creates resentment and attracts thieves. Wealth that's shared creates community and attracts allies. If we help other families prosper, they'll help us protect what we've built. Maria smiled at Jake's proposal, recognizing the wisdom behind it. "You think like our grandfather did, Jake. You understand that true security comes not from hiding wealth, but from building communities of people who benefit from each other's success." The legal formalization of their partnership took several months, requiring navigation of territorial bureaucracy and the kind of political connections that Jake's years as a government courier had provided. But by Christmas of 1882, the Montoya Thornfield Mining Company was officially established as one of the largest legitimate mining operations in the Arizona territory. The front business they established a combination assay office, metalworking shop, and mining supply company, quickly became a hub for the Mexican-American mining community in Tucson. Diego's expertise in evaluating ore deposits made him the most sought-after consultant in the region, while Jake's knowledge of American business practices helped dozens of smaller miners navigate the legal requirements of claim filing and tax compliance. But it was the training program that had the most lasting impact on the community. Young Mexican-Americans learned traditional mining techniques alongside modern business practices, creating a generation of skilled craftsmen and entrepreneurs who could compete successfully in the territorial economy. "What we're building here," Jake observed during their first annual partnership meeting, "is bigger than just a mining company. We're creating a model for how different communities can work together for mutual benefit." The success of the Montoya Thornfield Mining Company attracted attention from throughout the Southwest, but it also attracted the kind of trouble that Jake had predicted when large amounts of wealth became publicly known. By the spring of 1883, they were dealing with everything from claim jumpers and bandits to corrupt territorial officials who wanted bribes in exchange for protection. The most serious threat came from a group of investors from San Francisco who believed they could simply buy out or intimidate the Mexican-American mining operation. Led by a ruthless businessman named Cornelius Wade, they offered first to purchase the company at below market prices, then began using legal harassment and economic pressure when their initial overtures were rejected. "These people don't understand what they're dealing with," Wade told a reporter from the Tucson newspaper. "This is American territory now, and American business practices should prevail. We can't have foreign elements controlling strategic mineral resources." The racial undertones of Wade's campaign created exactly the kind of community division that Jake had hoped to avoid. Some Anglo residents of Tucson began viewing the Mexican-American mining operation with suspicion, while Mexican Americans rallied to defend what they saw as an attack on their entire community. "This is what our grandfather feared most," Diego confided to Jake during a tense meeting with their lawyers. "Success that makes us targets for those who believe wealth should belong only to people who look like them." Jake's response drew on everything he'd learned about building coalitions during his years in the cavalry. "Then we make sure we have allies who don't look like any of us. This isn't about Mexican versus American, it's about honest business versus corruption, community building versus exploitation." The strategy they developed was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of fighting Wade's investors directly, they formed partnerships with established Anglo businesses throughout Tucson, creating a network of mutual interests that transcended racial boundaries. The hardware store that sold mining equipment, the bank that processed their deposits, the freight company that transported their ore, the hotel that housed their business visitors all became stakeholders in the success of the Montoya Thornfield operation. "When you attack us, you attack all of Tucson," Jake explained to a gathering of business leaders that included both Mexican Americans and Anglo entrepreneurs. "Our success means more jobs, more tax revenue, more prosperity for everyone in this community." The coalition they built proved strong enough to withstand Wade's pressure campaign. When his investors tried to bribe territorial officials, they found themselves facing not just the Montoya family but a united front of Tucson's most influential citizens. When they attempted to file competing claims on Montoya mining sites, they discovered that the legal community had closed ranks against outsiders trying to steal established businesses. Most importantly, when Wade's men resorted to violence attempting to sabotage mining equipment and intimidate workers, they found themselves confronting not just the Montoya family's security measures, but a community-wide network of mutual protection that included Anglo ranchers, Mexican vaqueros, Apache scouts, and even reformed outlaws who'd found legitimate employment in the expanded mining operations. The final confrontation came when Wade himself arrived in Tucson with a small army of hired gunmen, intending to seize the Montoya mining claims by force. He'd underestimated both the strength of the community coalition and the military experience of the men who'd built it. Jake, with his cavalry background and knowledge of desert warfare, coordinated the defense alongside Diego's brother Carlos, who'd fought as a guerrilla during the Mexican War. Their forces included not just miners and workers, but volunteers from throughout Tucson, who understood that allowing outside investors to terrorize local businesses would set a precedent that threatened everyone's security. The battle for control of the Montoya mining claims lasted 3 days and ended with Wade's mercenaries fleeing back to California with their tails between their legs. But more importantly, it established the Montoya Thornfield Mining Company as a symbol of successful community resistance to outside exploitation. "What happened here?" observed Dr. Morrison, the geologist who'd been with Jake's original expedition and had stayed in Tucson to study the geological formations, represents something new in the American West. Instead of wealth being concentrated in the hands of distant investors, we've seen a local community take control of its own resources and use them for mutual benefit. The victory over Wade's investors allowed the mining company to expand its operations throughout the Arizona territory, always following the same model of community partnership and shared prosperity that had proved so successful in Tucson. Within 5 years, the Montoya Thornfield name was associated with more than 20 different mining operations, each one structured to benefit local communities while generating substantial profits for the partners. Jake found himself transformed from a solitary courier into one of the most influential businessmen in the Southwest, but the change had happened so gradually and naturally that he barely noticed it. His life was no longer marked by the loneliness and rootlessness that had characterized his post-war years. Instead, he was anchored by relationships and responsibilities that gave meaning to his daily activities. The Montoya children, Miguel and Sofia, grew up considering him a beloved uncle whose stories of adventure and frontier life were balanced by practical lessons in business and community leadership. Miguel showed aptitude for the geological aspects of mining, while Sofia demonstrated remarkable skill at the diplomatic and organizational tasks that held their extended business network together. "You know," Sofia told Jake on her 16th birthday, "when I was little, I used to think you were just Papa's friend, who helped us when we were in trouble. Now I understand that you became part of our family the moment you chose to help strangers without expecting anything in return." Her words captured the essential truth about what had transformed Jake's life so completely. By choosing compassion over self-interest during that first encounter in the desert canyon, he'd set in motion a chain of events that had brought him wealth, purpose, and the kind of deep human connections he'd never thought possible. Diego, now in his 50s and recognized as one of the territory's leading mining experts, often reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him from desperate refugee to prosperous business owner. "I used to think that success meant accumulating enough wealth to be safe from any possible threat," he told Jake during one of their evening conversations on the porch of Jake's impressive Tucson mansion. "But now I understand that real security comes from building relationships strong enough to weather any storm." The mining company continued to prosper well into the new century, eventually becoming one of the founding businesses of what would become Arizona's modern mining industry. But its most lasting legacy wasn't the wealth it generated. It was the model it provided for how different communities could work together for mutual benefit. When historians later studied the economic development of the American Southwest, they noted with interest the unusual success of the Montoya Thornfield Mining Company and the role it had played in creating some of the region's most stable and prosperous communities. What they might not fully understand was the simple act of kindness that had made it all possible. Jake lived to be 79, spending his final years as a beloved patriarch whose life story became legend throughout the Arizona territory. The ranch he built on the outskirts of Tucson became a gathering place for the extended network of families and businesses that had grown from his partnership with the Montoyas, a testament to what could be accomplished when people chose cooperation over competition. At his funeral, speakers from a dozen different cultural backgrounds stood to honor a man who had bridged divides and built communities wherever he went. But it was little Sophia, now a grandmother herself and one of Arizona's first female mining engineers, who captured the essence of what Jake's life had represented. "He taught us that wealth isn't measured by what you accumulate for yourself, but by what you make possible for others," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd of mourners. "A cowboy helped a family in the desert, and that family returned with gold, but the real treasure wasn't the metal we pulled from the ground. It was the proof that kindness multiplies when it's invested wisely." The Montoya Thornfield Mining Company continued operations well into the 20th century, eventually becoming part of the industrial foundation that transformed Arizona from frontier territory to modern state. The techniques they pioneered for community-based resource development influenced mining operations throughout the West, proving that prosperity shared was more sustainable than wealth hoarded. But perhaps the most fitting monument to Jake's legacy was the scholarship fund established in his name, which provided mining and engineering education to students from all backgrounds who demonstrated both technical aptitude and commitment to community service. Each year, dozens of young people learned not just how to extract wealth from the earth, but how to use that wealth to lift up everyone around them. The bronze plaque at the entrance to the Jake Thornfield School of Mining bore a simple inscription that captured the philosophy he'd lived by. He helped strangers become family, and family helped him build a community where everyone could prosper. In the Red Rock Canyons north of Tucson, where Jake had first encountered the desperate family that would change his life forever, a small marker still stands beside the desert spring where they'd camped during Diego's recovery. Visitors who make the difficult journey to this remote spot often report feeling a sense of peace and possibility that seems to emanate from the landscape itself. Local Apache and Tohono O'odham people say the place is sacred, marked by spirits who bless those who show kindness to strangers. Mexican-American families still make pilgrimages to the spring, bringing their children to hear the story of how compassion shown without expectation of reward had created opportunities that benefited generations. The gold mines that made the Montoya Thornfield fortune eventually played out, as all mines eventually do. But the community networks they'd created, the business relationships they'd fostered, and the model of inclusive prosperity they'd demonstrated continued to generate value long after the last ore had been extracted from the desert earth. Modern Tucson still bears the mark of Jake Thornfield's influence, though most residents don't realize it. The multicultural character of the city, the tradition of cooperation between different ethnic communities, and the emphasis on building local businesses that benefit everyone. All of these can be traced back to the partnership between a helpful cowboy and a grateful family, who returned his kindness with opportunities beyond his wildest dreams. And sometimes on clear desert evenings when the saguaro cacti stand silhouetted against the Arizona sunset, old-timers swear they can still hear the echo of children's laughter carried on the wind, the sound of Miguel and Sofia Montoya playing around their family's camp, while a lonely cowboy named Jake Thornfield learned that the greatest treasure a man can find isn't buried in the ground, but hidden in the hearts of people whose lives he's chosen to touch with unexpected kindness. The golden return had indeed transformed everyone involved, but not in the way anyone could have predicted. What started as a simple act of helping strangers in distress had evolved into a legacy of community building and shared prosperity that would influence the American Southwest for generations to come, proving that sometimes the most valuable investments are those we make in other people's hopes and dreams. In the end, Jake's story became more than just a tale of frontier adventure and unexpected wealth. It became a timeless reminder that true fortune comes not from what we extract from the earth or accumulate in our bank accounts, but from what we contribute to the lives of others and the communities we help create along the way.